Welcome, everyone, to this year's convening, Truth and Transformation 2020, Beyond Diversity and Inclusion, Examining the Limits of the Business Model. We have over 1,000 people registered with 3 keynotes, 3 panels, and 2 live performances lined up, and we're very excited you can be with us today. We're using a new platform, so first I will ask for your patience as we deal with any technical glitches. If you need any technical help, please direct message Shorenstein Center. Put your comments and questions in the chat box to the right, and we'll be reading those throughout the day. Please tweet and post to social media, hashtag Truth and Transformation at IARA_HKS. You can direct message any participants to the right-hand panel. All keynotes and panels will be recorded, closed captioned, and sent to registrants at a later date. Performances will not be recorded, and we ask that you do not record them. Over lunch, we will have Jason Eskridge performing live, and we'll also have an opportunity for you to use the networking option on Hopin. If you want to learn more about today's presenters, please visit our website. The link will be pinned in the chat. Please note today's convening was free and open to the public, and we hope to keep it that way. If you would like to donate to the IRA project, you can do so by following the Donate Now button, also pinned in the chat. Finally, in the next few weeks, the IRA project will be launching a new website to democratize data around anti-racism research. We will follow up with everyone who is registered for the convening today when our website, the Race, Research, and Policy Portal, or RAP, goes live. We are honored today to open the convening with Elizabeth Solomon, an enrolled member and officer of the Massachusetts tribe at Ponkapog. She is currently the Director of Administration in the Department of Social and Behavioral Sciences at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health, and will give our land acknowledgement. Elizabeth, I pass it over to you.
I'm speaking to you from native space. I'm speaking to you from native space and the traditional lands of the Massachusetts tribe, where Harvard is located. If you live or visit our lands, I ask that you treat them as something precious, because they are. When Indigenous communities in the United States gather together, they traditionally acknowledge and honor the ancestral holders of the land that they are meeting on. Many non-Native communities have begun to incorporate this practice in public events, both to honor the Native peoples who belong to the land and to recognize that the use of the lands by others has come as a result of the displacement of its original holders. 10,000 years ago, Boston Harbor was dry land, and we were here. 1,000 years ago, much as what is now known as the city of Boston was underwater, and we were here. 400 years ago, English colonists came to occupy our land, and we were here. Today, most of Greater Boston is a major urban area occupied by others, and still, we are here. Here is where we laughed, cried, loved, made music, practiced our beliefs, shared both food and knowledge, and made both useful and sacred things. Here is where we raised our children and buried and honored our dead. Here's where English colonists began their conquest of the continent. Here is where our relationships with the colonists were built, destroyed, and built again. Some of these relationships were friendly and beneficial. Others were fraught with conflict, sadness, and loss. Here is where those who came to live among us saw land, resources, and sometimes people as commodities to be bought and sold. Here is where we maintained, sometimes in secret, our commitment to our own values and beliefs about the nature of the world, the land, resources, and people. Here is where we made alliances, intermarried, and made ongoing communities with people from other Native groups and with those from other cultures. Here is where we continue to live, holding the land and the traditions of our ancestors, and here is where our children's children will continue after us. Here is where we laugh, cry, love, make music, practice our beliefs, share both food and knowledge, and make both useful and sacred things. Here is where we raise our children and bury and honor our dead. Most of us are familiar with the colonization that affected this entire continent and much of the world. The effects of this colonization remain with us and are particularly relevant to the topics we will discuss today. But do not imagine that the colonization of this place was something that happened and was completed centuries ago, or that it is currently limited to certain peoples, places, or practices. The systems that resulted in the colonization of this land and its people are still in place. The colonization of this place and others continues, and we are all complicit in this continued colonization. We continue to colonize when we build so many structures that we cannot see or touch the actual earth, that other living things are permanently displaced, and that rainwater must be diverted far away from where it lands. We continue to colonize when we gentrify neighborhoods, not to improve the lives of those who already live there, but rather to displace their homes, their way of life, and their institution so that we may be more comfortable. We continue to colonize when we ignore or discount the unique knowledge, beliefs, and perspectives of those who do not have the background, education, vocabulary, or resources that we enjoy. We continue to colonize when we work and study and shop in small protected enclaves that separate us from the communities around us. We continue to colonize when we use a community's resources but fail to contribute to its well-being. We continue to colonize anytime we hoard resources for the benefit of the few. These acts of continued colonization are not limited to us with power, those of us with power, influence, or riches. This continued colonization is part of a bigger system in which we all participate. Colonization is not a concept. It is a way of being in the world that is dependent upon individual and collective acts of colonization. And each and every one of us, in small ways and in large ones, is a colonist. I mentioned earlier the protocol of acknowledging native lands and people, but I challenge non-native peoples and institutions to go beyond verbal land acknowledgements and to consider what it might really mean to honor native space. Honoring the land means honoring the entire space that we are a part of. It acknowledges our inseparable connectedness with everything else in the world. Honoring native space means understanding that everything we do, even the breaths that we take, has an effect well beyond our individual lives. So I honor the directions, I honor the land, I honor the water, I honor the sky, I honor the sun and the moon and the stars. I honor the other living things that share this space with us. I honor the ancestors who came before me and those who will come after me. I honor everything that lives with respect within this space. The honoring of native land and peoples may be new to you, and it's only a small part of this event. But I ask you to remember that wherever you are in the Americas and in much of the larger world, you are in native space and that there are indigenous people that belong to that place. Be mindful of how you interact with that space and with its people. May all that we do in native spaces both honor the land and prepare the way for all of those to come. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. My name is Erica Licht. I'm a senior fellow with the Institutional Anti-Racism and Accountability Project. And again, we're so happy to be with you all this morning. I have the pleasure of handing off to Seti Warren, the Executive Director of the Shorenstein Center on Media, Politics, and Public Policy at the Harvard Kennedy School. Amongst many roles, Seti previously served as mayor of Newton, Massachusetts from 2010 to 2018. And Seti will be joining us through a very savvy tech means via video here.
Thank you so much, Erica, for that introduction. On behalf of the Shorenstein Center and our Center Director, Nancy Gibbs, I want to welcome everyone to the Harvard Kennedy School for this incredibly important discussion we're going to have this afternoon and this morning. Before I offer some thoughts and introduce Dr. Muhammad, I want to thank Miriam Ashkenazi for her tireless effort as the project director for IRA over the years, not just for putting together this important event, but also getting this project off the ground. So thank you so much, Miriam, for your efforts. The Shorenstein Center's driving mission is to ensure that we have a healthy ecosystem of information. Our democracy depends on it. We do this by highlighting bad information that's in that ecosystem, disinformation and misinformation, so that people in the fields of media and public policy and organizations can make sound judgments. We also do this by highlighting good information and research so that organizations can make good, sound decisions for the people they represent. That's what IRA seeks to do. Highlight good information in regard to anti-racism work so that organizations can make progress, and highlight information and policy decisions that are not effective so that organizations can shift course and make change. That's why I'm so proud of the efforts by the IRA project and team, the progress they've made over the past years, and what they're going to do in the future. Now it's my honor and a real privilege and joy to introduce my friend, Dr. Muhammad. Dr. Muhammad brings a vast intellect to the Kennedy School, as well as this project in the Shorenstein Center. He brings remarkable teaching skills for all of us, including our students at the school. And he brings a vast, deep knowledge of institutional racism in the United States. But what's most important and unique is his leadership. He does this and he provides leadership by not being afraid to ask all of us to look ourselves in the mirror and ask the question, are we doing enough in regard to anti-racism in our own organizations? Are we actually embracing the right policies and procedures to make a difference in regard to anti-racism in our own organizations? And he brings together the leading minds in the field all around the world and our country to ensure that organizations can indeed make a difference in regard to anti-racism. So it's my pleasure and privilege to introduce our leader in this field and my friend, Dr. Khalil Muhammad.
Dear Seti, it is so great to have that incredible introduction from you, and I am deeply honored that you were able to join us today. Since your time at the Shorenstein Center, I've seen tremendous growth in what the center does, the kind of incredible research and knowledge that is put out in the world, the work of our colleague Joan Donovan in shielding our democracy against the disinformation that exists right now. And so I want to thank you, Seti, for your leadership, Nancy for hers, and for all the folks who work behind the scenes to make sure that the IRA project itself is able to do its best work. I am also extremely honored today to welcome you to the second annual Truth and Transformation Conference of the IRA Project. We are very pleased to have all of you join us today. Over 900 people, up to over 1,000 at this point, a number far larger than we hosted last year, have registered for this conference. You've heard a little bit about who I am, but I want to tell you a little bit more about the project itself. I am joined in this work by a fabulous team. Our project director, Miriam Ashkenazi, who Seti just mentioned, is the backbone of the work that we do. She holds it all together and like a composer is able to direct many moving parts. And so I am grateful for her tireless commitment to this work. She's a former emergency room physician and an international humanitarian. And so she's seen some really tough stuff. And I'm grateful that she's willing to face the work that we do squarely in the face. I also want to thank Senior Fellow Erica Licht, who you will see later today. She is an established anti-racist trainer in her own right and brings a wealth of practice and experience to our work. I'm grateful that she's leading our project with the Kellogg Foundation on looking at racial healing practices globally so that we might here begin to do some of the truth and reconciliation work that the United States needs. Also, our postdoctoral fellow, Suraj Yindi, is an amazing scholar of caste. He's one of the world's most celebrated and controversial, for good reason, Dalit scholars. He's been with us now for more than 2 years at the Shorenstein Center and supporting the IRA project more generally. So I'm grateful for Suraj's contributions. We have an advisory member, Carrie Ratcliffe, who provides hours and hours of volunteer work to support us, and we're grateful for Carrie and all that she brings. Ali Hinsky of the Shorenstein Center continues to be an amazing staff person to support us. We also have several current Kennedy School students and members of the HKS, or the Harvard Kennedy School Equity Coalition. They are Ratna Gill, Ariel Exner, who will both be live tweeting, along with Benjamin Aptan, who's a current course assistant of mine. So that's who we are, that's the team, and you're going to see from today's conference over the next several hours how important this work is to all of us. So SETI mentioned briefly a little bit about the IRA project. I want to say a few things more. We are a one-year-old research initiative whose goal is to collect evidence of what's working and not working, largely in the private and nonprofit sectors, where claims of diversity and inclusion, or equity and belonging, seem to consistently fall short of changing the norms and practices of organizations. The project's first phase is to examine published research, both by academics and practitioners, to produce what we call a meta-analysis, a big picture of what's the best out there that we know when it comes to racial equity and organizational behavioral change. In many ways, we are contributing to the body of work of our own colleagues, Frank Dobbins in sociology and Robert Livingston here at the Harvard Kennedy School. Recently, I was asked by the Harvard Gazette, what are the primary obstacles to racial equity in workplaces? Is it sins of commission or sins of omission, or both? Well, here's what I said. I said all of the above. Some of the research suggests that companies have no intention of doing anything more than passing a symbolic litmus test. That is, how do we look? Do we have enough representation to satisfy customer expectations? Do we have the appropriate systems in place so that our own employees can feel included in affinity groups or in employee resource groups? A lot of companies are still hiring diversity officers for the first time, which is already known to be a fairly weak adaptation when it comes to failing to achieve a company's own diversity goals. We have good evidence that diversity officers are not very effective, especially when firms don't expect to change the way they do business or the way that HR policies are established. One of the things that we're noticing is that companies that are more honest about their past, whether it is a 200-year-old company or a 20-year-old one or a tech startup, there's a good chance that given the existing racialized and gendered power dynamics that exist in the United States, that unless you were intentional, you are not going to be a very diverse place. The second question becomes, what are the blind spots of the leadership that prevented it from seeing areas of the company's business model that might either be doing harm or be neglecting parts of the community it claims to serve? Those two things, what we call a historical reckoning, that's the truth part, taking stock of how your organization came to be and then acting intentionally to redress that path, would then lead a company to take affirmative intentional efforts. That's the transformation part. That is to, number one, diversify its personnel, and number two, consider how the business model itself might be perpetuating racial inequality or institutional racism. In addition to truth and transformation, the recurring theme of our annual conference, this is our second one, we are also interested in accountability. How do organizations hold themselves accountable for their stated goals? How do stakeholders in companies, in the company and outside of it, hold them accountable to their own goals? Surprisingly, we're still in an era when companies don't self-report very much data about their own stated diversity claims. They're not required to. So that's one area of accountability. If a company is serious, then it should have a robust set of metrics for measuring what it considers racial equity as it does any other core operation. The bigger question, though, is how do you achieve accountability sector by sector? That is one of the questions that IRA hopes to answer. We're using the example of environmental building codes that promote sustainable change, such as LEED standards, for example. If the IRA project can establish an accreditation process whereby companies that claim to be on a spectrum of diversity, racial equity, and anti-racism, where diversity goals are limited to, say, personnel representation, then perhaps you've just achieved a bronze certification. Racial equity would include something more robust in terms of your HR policies, that is, having a clear system of how to report micro and macroaggressions, something that often is not very clear in the workplace today. That might get you a silver certification. And then anti-racism would be the platinum standard. That would be a way of also reflecting the way we do business in the world matches our stated values about the kind of nation we want to be part of. Establishing clear, transparent, and verifiable standards will benefit the private and nonprofit sectors, as well as civil society in general. Millions of people lose when companies and organizations don't practice what they preach, which is why we have accounting rules and reporting requirements for organizations such as FASB and GAAP rules. I'll admit, that's a little inside baseball, having started my career as a public accountant at Deloitte, informs how I personally think about accountability. As far as accountability standards, we know corruption and environmental degradation, like the kind that Elizabeth Solomon opened this morning up in talking about the history of colonization, are only the most obvious consequences when bad actors operate in the private sector with impunity. But there are many more deeply entrenched and more less obvious ways that organizations profit from enduring patterns and practices of racial and gendered exclusion, where black and brown women's bodies, brains, and assets, along with their partners and their children, are priced lower in the marketplace than their white, female, and male counterparts. Not only are they considered riskier employees to hire, riskier borrowers to lend money, riskier neighbors to live next door to, riskier students to share classmates with, risk is a pricing tool, an efficiency measure in the marketplace that assigns value. No one has to act consciously to game this system of profiting from discrimination, though of course some do. They just have to follow the market indicators and, of course, new algorithms of where people live, their credit scores, and their net worth in order to make money. Adding more black and brown people to your staff won't solve these problems, which is why we are here today to think through what are the limits of the current business model of diversity and inclusion. In this moment, it seems to us that the pressing question of how to move diversity and inclusion beyond where it's been in the private sector, as well as in other organizations, is more important than ever. Following a summer where millions took to the streets demanding an end to systemic racism in the United States, hundreds of organizations, if not thousands, issued Black Lives Matter and racial justice solidarity statements. My colleague, Erica Licht, our senior research fellow, and I published an op-ed, Why Words Aren't Enough for Companies Claiming to Support Black Lives Matter, in the Boston Globe, July 7th edition. We wrote, solidarity statements allow companies to invest in goodwill without investing in substantive change, a practice also known as diversity washing or reputational laundering. What organization wants to be accused of being pro-racist or complacently silent? The bar for public reckoning has been set low in the United States. Public efforts at recognizing and committing to dismantling systems of oppression and institutional racism remain often trivial at best. In many corporate statements, familiar themes have emerged, calling out racism, standing with the black community, and speaking up as allies. But these words are not enough. If history is any guide, without a roadmap, organizations will fail to act in meaningful and sustainable ways. And yet, based on our research so far, we remain cautiously optimistic that real change is possible. Here's what we hope for. Companies must first be honest in their solidarity statements about their own past failures. This isn't just about what happens beyond the company's walls, but in fact also what happens inside that moves outside. And the perpetual goal of achieving diversity cannot be a substitute for redistributing organizational power and pursuing racial justice in society. every company should track its overall percentage of black employees or brown employees or historically marginalized employees, including those in senior leadership and on boards, as well as the actual expenses funneled toward ending systemic racism. That's right. How does a company itself lean into the kind of society it wants to be part of? Leaders must reckon with, for instance, why their company may overcharge black customers for goods, services, and access to credit, or why their enhanced security surveillance of black shoppers is not much different than racial profiling by the police. They must also recognize that all of us, individuals and organizations alike, are interdependent. The racial oppression in society mirrors and catalyzes racial oppression in the workplace. What's painfully clear about diversity and solidarity statements is they are a lot easier to write than to follow. After all, most everyone has both. So pursuing anti-racist change isn't easy or comfortable. Organizations must account for their own exclusionary histories and their ongoing policies and practices of systemic racism where they find them. They must be held accountable. In the current issue of the Scientific American, the journalist Abigail Libbers writes on how, quote, implicit bias training isn't enough, what actually works. She cites a recent analysis of 492 studies, including 87,000 participants, on the effectiveness of implicit bias training and found weak effects on unconscious bias. The authors wrote, quote, most studies focused on producing short-term changes with brief single-session manipulations, and that most trainings produce trivial changes in behavior. The authors conclude that the changes in implicit bias are possible, but they do not necessarily translate into changes in explicit bias or behavior, and there is a significant lack of research on these long-term effects. Indeed, one of those researchers, my colleague Frank Dobbin, notes that going all the way back to the 1930s, such implicit bias efforts have failed time and time again. I'll even add, as someone who studies criminal justice practices, I can tell you going back to 1922 in the midst of a massive anti-black riot in Chicago, one of the conclusions at the time amongst those who studied it, the officials who looked closely into it, including the governor of Illinois, was that unconscious bias was a problem and they were going to do something about it. So I think we have pretty good evidence that we've got to do a lot more than that. And so we realize in the grand scheme of things that this is very dispiriting. Our goal, though, is not to despair, but to be honest, to be truthful, to rise to the challenge, to keep our head out of the sand, but clearly focused on the horizon, and to promote the solutions that may require truly transformative work, one organization and one institution at a time. We will either wake up or keep hitting the snooze button. That's the choice we make. But I can speak for all of us here at the IRA Project. We're glad you woke up this morning to join us. What are we trying to accomplish today? We've assembled an amazing group of people who have been doing this work, and we want to have these insiders speak to us based on what they've learned. We don't want to know the obvious. We want to know what we don't know. This gives us a chance at IRA to test our own assumptions and to learn from others. We hope the 1,000 of you watching will benefit as well.